Hertfordshire, albeit virtually. I was sharing with Liz and Eva and Jean my memory of working in Hemel Hempstead back in 1974 as an education welfare officer, and when I got a place on a social work education course, I also had some cases from what we would now know as adult social care. And I well remember my first self-neglect case in Hemel Hempstead, an older woman living in an apartment up the hill in Hemel Hempstead, who had no running water, whose toilet wasn't working, and who was using newspapers and milk bottles for things that one would ordinarily use the toilet for. And I can remember wondering how on earth I was going to help this particular person. That's one of my early memories of social work. And my other early memory of social work is navigating the roundabout in Hemel Hempstead at the bottom of the hill, and wondering whether I should turn left or right. And I never got the hang of it in the couple of years that I was working there. So it's good to be back. And I'm now going to share my screen and begin the formal presentation. The slides and a handout version of the slides are available. I have absolutely no objection to any of you having the slides and the handout, and equally, if you find any of this useful and want to share it with your team colleagues and others with whom you work, that is absolutely fine by me. What I'm going to do in the course of the morning is present to you what I think is the best evidence we have for working with people who experience homelessness, including insecure forms of accommodation and the interface with adult safeguarding. And what I hope you'll do in the course of the morning is to share your reflections on how close to the evidence base the service that you work for gets, and how close to the evidence base you think the multi-agency, multidisciplinary architecture in Hertfordshire gets to the evidence base. And if you think that you get close, or actually align fully with the evidence base, then what has enabled you and the services to do that? And if there are obstacles or barriers, what are those obstacles or barriers? And that kind of appreciative inquiry or temperature check will be very useful for Liz and her colleagues on the Safeguarding Adult Board in Hertfordshire in taking forward the strategic priority that the board has in relation to homelessness. It will also be very useful when I begin the thematic review for the board in Hertfordshire, and that review is due to start shortly after Easter. So when I stop presenting at various points and invite you to share your observations as well as to ask questions, I hope that you will take the opportunity to share with me and to share with Liz and with each other what enables best practice with people experiencing homelessness in Hertfordshire and what gets in the way of it. So that's the focus, broadly speaking, for the morning. I'm a great believer in evidence-informed practice or evidence-based practice, but that evidence comes not just from academic researchers, and I was one of those for a considerable period of time. There is some very valuable research evidence in relation to people experiencing homelessness, most recently done by Jill Manthorpe, Jess Harris and colleagues at King's College London, and you can find their research evidence on the King's College London website. But the evidence also comes, as Liz foregrounded, from safeguarding adult reviews, and I'll present some of that evidence today. But crucially, it also comes from people with lived experience, and I will present today some of the viewpoints and perspectives that have been offered to me and others by individuals who have experienced homelessness. And the evidence base also comes from practitioners and operational managers and senior leaders across health, housing and social care, across statutory and third sector organisations. So we do actually have an evidence base. We do know what is most likely to work with people experiencing homelessness. No guarantees, but we do have an evidence base. Hence the importance of your temperature check and appreciative inquiry this morning. In line with making safeguarding personal, which I hope you all know is a key principle within adult safeguarding and indeed within the Care Act, I'm going to start with what we can learn from the voices of experts by experience, people with lived experience of homelessness. And on this particular slide, you will see that I have referenced three safeguarding adult reviews, all of which in fact were thematic in the sense that they looked at more than one case. All of the reviews I talk about this morning are published. They are accessible on the individual Safeguarding Adult Board website, and some of them are also accessible on the National Safeguarding Adult Review Library, the web address for which I will try to remember to put in the chat before we finish. I want to highlight the first bullet point on this slide in particular, because when Terence was asked what he needed, the first statement that came into his mind was "some love, man." In my experience as a social worker, we talk about autonomy, we talk about self-determination, we talk about choice, we talk about empowerment, we talk about making safeguarding personal. We might get as far as talking about compassion or dignity or concerned curiosity. It's unusual to hear social workers talk about love. And yet that's what Terence foregrounded when he was asked what he needed. And I've had the pleasure of listening to a number of people with lived experience, and what consistently they say is what they actually really appreciate is the time that people spend. It's not so much how many coins you put in the empty coffee cup that might be in front of them if they're sitting somewhere on the street. It's not so much how many coins you put in, it's the amount of time you spend. And it's the attitude that you convey, the concerned curiosity that you convey when you spend that time. And when I listen to that, and when I hear and read what Terence said, I reflect on my own attitudes and values. Before the pandemic, I was a regular user of trains and tubes in London. And I would often emerge from a station and I would see one or potentially more than one person sitting with an empty cup in front of them, surrounded more or less by their belongings. And I had to challenge myself about the attitudes, the unconscious biases, the stereotypes, the assumptions that very easily drop into my mind, perhaps because of some of the representations of people who experience homelessness in the media. Do we actually think of love? Do we actually think of concerned curiosity? Do we actually think of human rights and social justice? Or do we actually think about substance misuse, alcohol dependence, dependence on other drugs? When we encounter people like Terence, do we think twice about what we might put into a cup? What attitudes or values do we have to wrestle with when we encounter people like Terence? And do we actually have the time to spend, and indeed, if we're critically honest with each other, the motivation to spend time with people like Terence? The other bullet point that I particularly want to profile here is the comment from Ms. I's partner on this slide. Ms. I, a woman in her early 40s from memory, died as a result of a combination of homelessness, self-neglect, substance misuse, and all the physical and mental health challenges that accompany such a life journey. And I had the privilege of interviewing Ms. I's partner when I did this thematic review for Tower Hamlets. And what stayed with me, in addition to his own resilience and determination to recover from experiences of substance misuse and homelessness, what really stayed with me was his observation about his partner. He described that there were times when she tried to stay clean. She tried to stop drinking alcohol to the volumes that she had been drinking, that she tried to stop using different Class A drugs, that she tried to maintain a tenancy, and indeed to live with her partner. But that each time she tried to be alcohol-free and drug-free, things bubbled up for her. And what he meant by the things that bubble up were the traumas, the adverse childhood experiences, the adverse adult experiences that his partner had lived through. And his hypothesis, his evidence-based hypothesis, was that she had engaged in substance misuse and indeed in other risky behaviours in order to attempt to safeguard herself from the mental distress that was within her because of the adverse experiences. And what he said was that she needed wraparound support, that simply providing accommodation was not enough, that simply treating the physical manifestations, the physical impact of her substance misuse was not enough. That actually what she needed was a coordinated wraparound support if she was to be able to manage the emotions and the challenges that emerged when she tried to recover. And that is indeed what he was experiencing, that wraparound support. And indeed, when I interviewed him, he sat with the support of his psychotherapist, who was part of the wraparound care that he himself was receiving in order to try to navigate his own lived experience. And that's a way of us challenging ourselves about whether people are actually making what we often assume to be, or hear other people assume to be, lifestyle choices. Well, Mazai didn't have to drink, did she? She could stop drinking if she chose to. She didn't have to use Class A drugs, did she? She could stop if she chose to. She didn't have to be homeless, did she? She didn't have to sell sex, did she? That these were lifestyle choices. How often have we heard in our day-to-day work somebody articulate the view that this is a lifestyle choice or an unwise decision? And a way of challenging that is to read this poem. I've given you the reference where you can find it in an adult safeguarding and homelessness publication on the Local Government Association website. What you've got here is just an extract of a poem written by somebody experiencing homelessness, experiencing self-neglect, alcohol dependent, with repetitive admissions into hospital, repetitive attendances at emergency departments, and the response was always the same: to treat the immediate physical manifestations of self-neglect and of homelessness and of alcohol addiction. In a sense, to clean him up, sober him up, and then discharge him. That was the consistent response over a considerable period of time. No one really thought that this was an adult safeguarding situation. No one really thought that what this individual needed was some wraparound care and a coordinated, collaborative intervention across housing, health and social care. Our housing colleagues in the end did in fact find him somewhere to live, temporary accommodation in a hotel that was being used to house people experiencing homelessness, but that was not supported by health and adult social care providing what they could provide in order to offer wraparound support. This individual predicted that he would die as a result of alcohol dependence and self-neglect, and sadly, that is indeed what happened. So from the voices of lived experience, both those who have survived the lived experience of homelessness and those who sadly have not, they remind us about the importance of seeing the whole person, not just that little bit of the person that is immediately the responsibility of the service for which we work, and to acknowledge that there is always a backstory. And it is the backstory that we need with time, with persistence, and sometimes with no little courage to uncover and to address. There are multiple routes into homelessness, as I'm sure that you all appreciate. Adverse childhood experiences, adverse adult experiences, relationship breakdowns, domestic abuse, loss of employment, loss of welfare benefits and no recourse to public funds, a variety of routes into homelessness. And there is always a backstory, and it is the backstory that we need to attempt to uncover and address. And that essentially is the message from Ms. I's partner. And we need to be careful in the hyphenated sense of that word. So it's going back to Terence's use of the word love. And whilst we might not use that word to characterize the work that we do in housing, health, social care, and the third sector, we do need to think about how careful do people think we are when we are working with them. This may sound to a degree challenging. It may sound to a degree confrontative. But I hope that you will respond with reflections on whether or not it is possible for you in the multi-agency, multidisciplinary architecture in Hertfordshire to practice in this way. If it is possible, what enables that to happen? If it is not possible, what gets in the way? Such that the Safeguarding Adult Board in Hertfordshire can perhaps begin to address the obstacles and the barriers. So if that's what we learn from people with lived experience, or some of what we learn from people with lived experience, that enables us to develop a concept which colleagues at King's College London have done much to pioneer alongside other researchers and indeed Safeguarding Adult Review authors like myself. It has enabled us to develop the phraseology of multiple exclusion homelessness, that this is not just a question of providing a roof over somebody's head. This is also about seeking to address the backstory. That could be childhood trauma, it could be physical and mental ill health, substance misuse, experiences of institutional care, including care experienced young people, which is why it is really important on this journey that adult social care and children's social care work closely together, that adult mental health and children's mental health services work closely together, that substance misuse services for young people work closely with substance misuse services for adults. Why? Because roots into homelessness, roots into self-neglect, roots into substance misuse and mental distress often begin in childhood. So we need to accept that for many of the individuals who are homeless, living in insecure or temporary forms of accommodation, individuals who are sofa surfing, many of those individuals will experience multiple exclusions, and that's what this slide captures. So part of the temperature check or appreciative inquiry that I'm really encouraging you to use this forum to articulate is, if we understand that there are multiple routes into homelessness and that very often there is a backstory that includes multiple exclusions, how easy or how difficult is it for you to be part of a whole system approach to those individuals? I'll have more to say about the legal rules and the strengths and the weaknesses of the legal rules towards the end of the morning. But I just want to highlight here that homelessness is, in part at least, an adult social care and adult safeguarding issue. It's not just a housing issue. Adult social care has to take, and adult safeguarding has to take some responsibility for people experiencing homelessness, not least because many of the individuals experiencing homelessness will have care and support needs that arise from or are related to physical or mental impairment or illness, including learning or cognitive disabilities, substance misuse, and crucially, but often overlooked, acquired brain injury. And all of that is articulated in the eligibility criteria regulations that accompany the Care Act. And in my experience as a SAR author and indeed as a SAB chair, the level of legal literacy within adult social care in the context of homelessness is often not appreciated. equally, what is often not appreciated is that not only is there a duty to meet eligible needs, and social workers and social care workers in the virtual room today will be very aware of the list of 10 eligible needs, and that the duty to meet eligible needs arises when there are two or more from the list of 10 are met. But there is a power to meet other needs. And when adult social care staff are making decisions about how to respond to people's needs, they must not forget that there is a power, a discretion to meet any care and support need, even if two or more on the list of 10 are not met. You will find that power in section 19. Do not overlook it. And as part of deciding whether or not to exercise the power to meet need, even if the statutory duty does not arise, a Human Rights Act assessment is absolutely crucial here. Individuals have a right to life. Individuals have a right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment. There will be cases where, if adult social care does not respond with a package of care, that could have major implications in terms of the individual's right to life and the individual's right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment. So what is the level of legal literacy in relation to human rights? What is the level of legal literacy in relation to the powers within the Care Act and not just the duties within the Care Act? And is there legal literacy in the sense that we should refer not just to the Care Act itself, but actually also to the statutory guidance that accompanies the Care Act? And as the guidance is statutory, it has the same force in law as the Act itself, and it should be followed by adult social care and adult safeguarding, in addition to being followed by other services who have roles and responsibilities in relation to the different processes that surround people with care and support needs. And here in the statutory guidance is a chapter on the interface with housing and care and support. The statutory guidance outlining how adult social care and housing colleagues are expected to work together in order to ensure that people have suitable accommodation within which then their care and support needs can be met. So again, a challenge from me to you about is the statutory guidance referred to consistently when housing colleagues and adult social care colleagues are looking at the same case of somebody experiencing homelessness. But we have to recognise, and I'll come back to this towards the end, no doubt, that actually the Care Act 2014 was not designed with homeless people in mind. It was designed, if you look at the 10 eligible needs, designed very much in with disabled people and with older people with increasing disabilities in mind, with a focus very much around activities of daily living on the assumption that somebody was securely housed. So we are struggling to a degree with a Care Act that was not designed for the kinds of complexities and challenges that many of you face. I'll stop shortly in order to give you the first opportunity to share your reflections with me and with Liz as independent chair of the Safeguarding Adult Board. But before I stop, I just want to refer to the national SAR analysis, so far the first and only analysis of all safeguarding adult reviews completed in England, all reviews completed between April 2017 and March 2019, and the Safeguarding Adult Board in Hertfordshire contributed its reviews into that national analysis, along with almost every other Safeguarding Adult Board in England. And we looked at 231 reviews. And you can see, broadly speaking, the distribution across at least some of the regions in England. And you can see that within that sample of 231, 25 SARs, in other words, around 11%, contained references to homelessness. That percentage has increased in my research experience subsequently. And that's a result of Safeguarding Adult Boards themselves being challenged by national government to give more attention to the interface between homelessness and adult safeguarding, and to give much more attention to reviewing the deaths of people experiencing homelessness. So that percentage has, at least to some degree, increased. 25% of the Safeguarding Adult reviews in that national analysis contained references to alcohol dependence, and that percentage has most certainly increased and is probably now somewhere around 40% of completed and published Safeguarding Adult reviews contain references to alcohol dependence. And 45% of the reviews contained references to self-neglect. And self-neglect remains the most frequently reviewed type of abuse or neglect in England. And obviously, many people experiencing homelessness also experience self-neglect. And if you're interested in accessing reviews that are in the public domain that focus on homelessness to a greater or a lesser extent, there are some slides in this slide deck that identify reviews that are in the public domain. There are several which I just want to briefly highlight. One is the Brighton and Hove review, known as X. That is the only review that I am so far aware of that involves a person transgender. So if you are working with or interested in the experiences of transgender individuals, people in the LGBTQ+ community, then that particular Safeguarding Adult review has something, I think, to offer to you. The Newham review, Mr. Y.I., Mr. Yee, was interesting because it was 4 Safeguarding Adult boards that came together to review a particular case of a person who was very transient across a number of London boroughs, where there were issues about ordinary residents and which London borough should assume responsibility for Mr. Y.I. And ordinary residents, not just in relation to housing and accommodation, but actually also which London borough should assume responsibility for his care and support needs. And in the end, 4 Safeguarding Adult boards led by Newham decided to review this case jointly because of concerns that Mr. Y.I. had been bounced around different London boroughs, including sometimes being transported around different London boroughs in the hope of finding one borough that would accept responsibility for him. Of course, as I'm sure you are aware, the local authority responsible for an individual is the local authority where that person is. Some other reviews thematic reviews, all in the public domain, some involving multiple cases. But a review that I particularly want to highlight here is the review known as Jack, published by Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly Safeguarding Adult Board. And I want to highlight this particular review because it's unusual in the sense that Jack was alive when the circumstances surrounding this particular review were being investigated, in fact, by me. Um, Basically, Jack had lived an itinerant lifestyle virtually all his life. Sometimes he had lived in different types of accommodation. Sometimes he had slept outside. Sometimes he had labouring jobs, farm worker jobs. Sometimes he lived without employment and indeed without welfare benefits because he was never in one place long enough to sign on, even if he was motivated to do so. Somebody in his late 70s, early 80s, becoming increasingly disabled and increasingly at risk of physical and financial abuse by others who saw him alcohol dependent and in various states of physical and mental distress wherever he happened to be. Sometimes he was in Scotland, sometimes in the north of England, sometimes in London, sometimes in the southwest of England. So rather like Mr. Y.I., he moved around. He didn't simply remain in one particular location. And so concerned in the end was a senior manager in Cornwall Adult Social Care about physical and financial abuse, about self-neglect, that she determined that the case would be presented to the Court of Protection. It had proved impossible to assess Jack's mental capacity because he was never in one place long enough. When he was provided with temporary forms of accommodation, he would very often leave, having spoiled the accommodation where he was residing. So lots of concerns, lots of risks, and in the end, a senior manager in Cornwall accepted responsibility on behalf of the local authority and asked the Court of Protection to intervene, initially in an interim way, in order to enable care and support and mental capacity and mental health assessments to be completed. And when they were completed, in fact, the Court of Protection then had to decide, as often adult social care practitioners have to decide, do we deprive Jack of his liberty to ensure that he is safe and receives the treatment that he needs for his physical and mental disabilities? He is likely to be unhappy but safe, or do we allow Jack to continue his itinerant lifestyle, doing our best to support him wherever he is, where he will be happy but at risk? In that particular case, the Court of Protection decided to prioritise his safety. The Haringey review is interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, an individual was wrongly classified as somebody with no recourse to public funds, and it took a third sector organisation and the local authority 9 months to rectify the records held by national government that would result in him being his entitlement to welfare benefits being reinstated. And during that time, he lost his tenancy and was sleeping in a shed. It's also important, that review, to highlight that we should not forget advocacy. So how assured is the board in Hertfordshire? How assured are the statutory services in Hertfordshire that advocacy is being used, mental capacity, mental health, care and support, domestic abuse, advocacy is being used to enable people to participate in assessments. And lastly, how assured are we that we accurately understand a person's race, culture, religion, language, and ethnicity? And I raise that because in this thematic review in Haringey, one of the individuals was known to have been born on the island of Cyprus, and he was assumed to be Turkish Cypriot. It wasn't until I was able to talk with one of the elected members in Haringey that she was able to clarify for me that in fact he was not Turkish Cypriot, he was Roma Cypriot. And if you know anything about the Roma community, you will know that they are very often discriminated against, oppressed and harassed by other communities. And that, she told me, is certainly the case on the island of Cyprus. There are not just two communities on the island of Cyprus, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot. There is at least a third community, and that is Roma Cypriot. And that there are three Cypriot communities in England, including in Haringey in London, and that this individual's experience was of discrimination and from other Cypriot communities in London. That was not appreciated by the services involved. How often do we pay close attention to somebody's race, culture, religion, language, and ethnicity? And then some more recent cases, some involving alcohol dependence, some involving dependence on other drugs, some involving adverse childhood experiences, very much reinforcing the idea of multiple exclusion homelessness, and very much reinforcing the idea that we need wraparound support. And when you look across those reviews, what we find positively are references to good practice. We find references to relationship-based practice, trauma-informed practice, practitioners across services being given the time to build relationships of trust in order then to begin to explore a person's care and support needs and the backstory. We find good examples of outreach by health services, GPs, district nurses, occupational therapists, tissue viability nurses, commissioned to provide outreach services rather than expecting individuals to come to our own locations at times that we designate. And similarly, examples where social workers are specifically employed with a remit for outreach to do care and support assessments where individuals are, whether that is on the street or in hotel rooms or wherever. So positive examples of outreach and positive examples of co-location of practitioners, housing, health, social care, psychologists, mental health practitioners co-located and working in a collaborative, cohesive way to provide wraparound care for people experiencing homelessness and associated exclusions. So there are references to good practice, but there are also references to practice shortfalls, assumptions, unconscious bias, stereotypes, unclear referral pathways, delayed or missing assessments of different types, and a lack of legal literacy. So again, when you're doing your appreciative inquiry, your temperature check, how much of this do you recognise, both the good practice but also the practice shortfalls? And in a moment, when I have listened to your early reflections and your feedback to the board, your feedback to Liz, Eva and Jean, I'll then go through the best evidence that we have from these different sources across these 5 domains. And the significance of the arrows is that we are looking for alignment. So it is only possible for individuals to get close to best practice when working with individuals, when they are part of a team around the person, and when their own organisation supports them in this challenging work to get close to the evidence base, and when a Safeguarding Adult Board provides policies, procedures, frameworks within which practitioners and operational managers and senior leaders across the services can work together. So I'm going to stop before I get into the evidence base itself, and to stop sharing my screen for a moment and to come back into the virtual room in the hope that you will share your observations, your reflections on what you've heard so far. You'll give your feedback to Liz and board members about what enables best practice, what gets in the way, and if you've any questions on what I've presented so far, I'll do my best to answer them. Then we'll have a comfort break, and then I'll go into the evidence base itself once again. So I'm going to stop talking now, and let's see how long the silence lasts. And I hope it doesn't last very long, because I shall start shifting about and get uncomfortable. So your observations, please. Oh, and Katie, thank you very much. I didn't have to wait very long. So what's your observation and or your question?
A couple of comments. I'm responsible for the housing and homeless service at a local authority, and I'm also the adult safeguarding lead, so I get kind of both sides of it. One of the things I think we struggle with from a housing perspective, homelessness, as you mentioned, no recourse to property. That is a real issue that I've sought advice from our DLUC advisor about, and as you said, it comes with multiple support needs. So we've got a couple on our streets at the moment, literally in a tent, which our outreach worker is going to see daily, but because of their additional support needs, like their alcohol use, they just don't engage. And very similar to one of the cases you mentioned, where you put them into TA, but they kind of damage it or behave in a way that they can't remain there. And so I think that's an area that we really do need to look at in Hertfordshire, because these clients are falling through the gaps because they don't meet the housing homelessness eligibility because of their no recourse. But they're neglecting themselves because they've got numerous health issues, the alcohol use, all of that. And then I was going to mention as well around self-neglect with mental health. So another client group we see quite a lot of is they've got significant mental health, often alongside another like substance or alcohol misuse. They're neglecting themselves because of that. They're in a terrible state, even if they're in our temporary accommodation. When I'm completing safeguarding referrals for self-neglect, for these concerns, they're being directed to SPA because they're saying the primary issue is mental health, but they're already engaging with the mental health team and getting their medication and all of that. When I say engaging, they're kind of getting their medication, that's it. So again, I think we need to do some work on that, because although maybe their primary issue is mental health, that along with the other issues is resulting in this extreme self-neglect, where they're choosing to spend all their money on substances, and we're finding them they're starving with no food, and they're neglecting their physical health. So I think those two elements is a big issue from us in terms of the housing and the self-neglect side. Sorry, go on.
No, go on, Katie. I thought you'd finished.
We work really, really closely with our partner agencies. Like, I think in Hertfordshire, we're very lucky that we do have really good relations I mean, one of the clients I'm working with yesterday, I requested a professional meeting with the adult disabilities team and the community mental health team, and we had that, and that was fantastic, and we can share that information. But ultimately, in some of the cases, there's no kind of pathway because they're not engaging. It's that that's the struggle, where the client is not engaging. They're choosing to continue, I suppose, their lifestyle of choice, they substance, etc. They're not engaging with various support services. So you kind of get to a bit of a stalemate of struggling what to do.
Okay, Katie, thank you very much. I'll respond to the points that you've made with some reflections of my own, but I'll see what else is in the virtual room before I do that, if that's okay. But thank you for your contribution, really helpful. Scott, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you. Possibly actually links in some ways with Katie's observations, and that was, they put it very bluntly, what does it take to get co-location and a defined pathway? Do we have to wait for a disaster, or is there another way of doing it?
Right. Well, I'll answer that now because you posed me a question. So I'll depart from what I said I would not do. I mean, I think one of the things that I hope will come out of today, and one of the things that may well come out of the thematic review that Liz has commissioned me to do beginning after Easter, is in a sense some challenges back to the board. And one of those challenges might be if we do not have a system that is at least in part working well for us, if there are parts of the system that are not working well for us, how are commissioners in particular and senior leaders generally going to address that? And I'm not surprised to hear that there may be a need to review the pathways that are in place and whether those pathways are sufficiently clear and sufficiently accessible for practitioners and operational managers. So I'm not surprised to hear that there may be a need to review the pathways that are in place and whether we've got sufficient pathways in place, not least for individuals who, despite the best efforts of the multi-agency, multidisciplinary architecture, the best efforts of people working together at the operational level, are still in situations of extreme risk, where there, in a sense, might need to be a kind of step up. And in a number of places, Plymouth being one, there is a defined step up pathway, and it's known as the complex case panel in Plymouth. And basically referrals go to the complex case panel, which is convened by the Director of Public Health, that has senior leaders, i.e. directors or deputy directors from across the different services. Cases are referred where all the usual working together mechanisms have not mitigated the risks, and where very senior high-level decisions need to be made about how to respond. So that's one example, if you like, of the review that I hope this and the thematic review will trigger, that in relation to pathways. And Liz has
Michael,
got
sorry, yeah,
I
just want to come in because and actually I'm going to bring this Kuvinder actually, because Hertfordshire have done a great big piece of work in relation to homelessness and pathways and complex. So actually she might be able to give a little bit of more information if this is the right point to bring you in.
Okay, so Vinda, you've been invited in, or you've been dumped in it, whichever.
That's great timing, because I had my hand up anyway. And I think the reason why I put my hand up was, Michael, to take advantage of your time as well. It's great to have you here. As Liz mentioned, Hertfordshire has recently joined the MEME network, 42 other areas across the country, to look at our approach to supporting adults experiencing multiple disadvantage.
Yeah.
And then the context behind that is that we've been piloting so many different models around co-location and multi-agency. We've got evaluations that are in place, and their findings are due kind of early next year. But I think for this group, Michael, it would be really good for us to understand the difference between multiple exclusion homelessness and multiple disadvantage.
I'm not sure that I would necessarily make such a distinction, Sukhvinder. I mean,
Good.
you know, it reminds me a bit about, you know, what I was listening to the news yesterday. You know, is the Metropolitan Police institutionally racist, and what, you know, what do we mean by the phrase, and so forth. Multiple exclusion, multiple disadvantage. I mean, I think they're probably one and the same thing. Or if you like, multiple disadvantages. You know, I have insufficient income on which to live. I don't have a roof over my head. You know, I am disadvantaged because I have COPD, or I have type 2 diabetes, or I have hepatitis C. I'm disadvantaged because you know, sometimes I think life's not worth living, and I feel suicidal. All of that can result in exclusions of different forms, you know, of services saying, well, you know, until you address your alcohol, we can't address your mental health, or vice versa, when of course you need to address both together. Or we can't provide you with temporary forms of accommodation because you're dependent on alcohol or other drugs. So I guess disadvantages can lead to other exclusions, but broadly speaking, I'd see the two of them together. I mean, in terms of examples of co-location, there are some examples of initiatives. East Sussex is one, where and I can provide links for you know, for Liz subsequently to today, where the different services involved have recognised that they have a population of people experiencing homelessness and other kinds of disadvantage and exclusion on top of that. And they've actually brought people together. So, you know, the psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, social workers, GP, and other primary care clinicians actually into a designated team that is resourced by commissioners from across the services in order to provide the specialist expertise in a combined way. And teams like that are producing evidence of success.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to sound that off with you, Michael, because often we can get very much tied in around the vocabulary and phrases. So yes, it means the same thing. And the co-location, as Liz mentioned, there are a couple of pilots underway in Hertfordshire where we brought the mental health specialist and the drug and alcohol kind of specialist workers embedded in housing teams as well, and alongside domestic abuse, because those are the key kind of indicators of support for homeless population in Hertfordshire. And me being another example about a system response to multiple disadvantage, the cases where there are no clear-cut pathways that have been commissioned, which will be brought to the strategic group, which is made up of key leaders across the system that can make decisions to flex where needed, or give permission to frontline workers to make differently. And as you said in those SAR reviews, it can often be a small decision that can change the trajectory of somebody's entire life. So no, great, I'll stop there, Liz, if that's all right, otherwise I'll be talking for the next hour.
Yeah, and I think alongside Sukhvinder, alongside you know, making every adult matter, which is what MEME stands for those who don't know, I'd add making every contact count. that there has to be no wrong door here. And what I find as a SAR author, and indeed what I learned as a senior university executive, was that if you simply signpost people to services, very often they don't get there. I found that out with students actually at the University of Bedfordshire. You know, they come into my office because, you know, I was the executive dean. You know, I could get things done, couldn't I? At least that's what the student was hoping. And I would say, well, you've come to the wrong place. You need to go there. But actually, I learned that if I simply pointed them in that direction, they might not get there. And if they did, I had no way of knowing. You know, it would take 5 minutes of my time to walk around the university with them and actually to take them to the door they needed to walk through. So making every contact count, no wrong door, take people rather than signpost. Okay, Madina, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. It was a reflection I had when you were talking about the manager who realized that this person's moving around and they're vulnerable. And I'm thinking sometimes we miss that sometimes in the cases that come towards me. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I am a deputy team manager in the safeguarding team. Right. And when referrals come to us and we make a decision that this needs care management, for example, or needs a care act assessment to establish what's happening. I'll give a case that I have just audited, where a gentleman has been provided with housing, but they have no furniture. They have funds, but I think they're misusing them, buying alcohol and stuff for others. And they're resulting to sleeping on the streets again and begging. And the decision we made was needs a care act assessment to see if there's anything there for us to support grants or anything that could help this gentleman. Yeah. But once it got to the locality team, they go, we've tried engaging with this person. He's told us he has no care and support needs, and we are closing the case. So I know he's going to come back at some point. And those are the ones where I'm wondering, you know, when you were talking about the legal literacy, we need to work. I don't know what we need to equip the workforce with to go an extra mile. Yes, he's refused to talk to me today, but maybe if I go tomorrow. Or which streets does he frequent? Does housing know this person? You know, maybe if I go with that housing officer, we will have a conversation with this gentleman and get to the bottom of what's happening. So I don't know what we need to do to equip the workforce with that curiosity you were talking about.
Thank you, Medina, and happy Ramadan. If I appreciate your picture correctly,
thank you.
Wish you well for that.
Thank you.
I think my response to that would be that the board and senior leaders need to give very clear permissions and lay out very clear expectations. In my view, simply closing a case because a person will not engage when there are unmitigated risks is not acceptable practice. I can understand why it happens. You know, the volume of cases coming through the different front doors, challenges perhaps in terms of recruitment and retention of staff and, you know, covering vacancies and so forth. I do not underestimate the challenges, but I think we have to clearly state what our expectations are and what our permissions are. And insofar as it is possible for senior leaders to acknowledge and address the challenges that operational managers and practitioners face, that should be part of how senior leaders respond. That's what I would expect. Fleur, and then Sue, and then I think we'll stop for a comfort break. Fleur.
Hiya, Michael. I've just heard quite a few times within this meeting the words won't engage or does not engage, and I just wonder if I could pose the question: is it that it's a complex system? I know I'm going a bit down the meme route, but we've said it quite a lot. So is that like a terminology, won't engage, and what does that mean? Could I ask you from your perspective?
I think you are very right to raise that. I often, as a SAR author or a SAB chair or in webinars like this, say, who is really not engaging here? You know, is it the individual who is not engaging, or is it we who are not engaging? And we're not engaging because we expect somebody who's experiencing homelessness, self-neglect, alcohol dependence, mental distress, suicidal ideation to turn up at 9 o'clock in the morning, you know, in the centre of Hemel Hempstead. And then we label them as not engaging when they don't come. We assume that they are unwilling. I'm reviewing a case at the moment. It's actually in the southwest of England. I'll call him Billy because that's the name we're using, was the name the family have asked us to use. So Billy. Billy has had 2 toes on 1 leg amputated. He has a below the knee amputation on his other leg. He is living in hostel accommodation, which is really not suitable for the disabilities that he has. He has traumas in his background that he is using Class A drugs in a sense to try to numb the pain from all of that. He experiences low mood, suicidal ideation, significant depression. And he often doesn't turn up for outpatient appointments, or he doesn't turn up for, you know, reviews by the substance misuse service. No one thinks about, well, we know where he lives. Why don't we go and see him? You know, his case was closed, or people assessed him in his absence. Rather than thinking, well, actually, he's not hard to find. And there was a support worker attached to the temporary accommodation, the hostel where he was living, who was in almost daily contact with him, who could have facilitated either Billy to get to where Billy needed to be, or could have facilitated people to come to Billy, but no one thought of that. So I think you're right to issue the challenge to us all. Who is not engaging here? So thank you for that, Fleur.
Thank you, Michael. That was interesting. Thank you.
Somebody had their hand up and then has put it down. Don't be bashful if you want to put your hand up. But if I go back to the first comment, which I didn't answer at the time, I think we've covered the point about, do we have clear enough pathways? Are there sufficient pathways for the kinds of complexities that we are encountering? So I think we've heard that message. The other point about self-neglect, mental health and adult safeguarding referrals being triaged out, I think there may be some assurance that Liz and colleagues might want to have if they haven't had it already, and that is how are mental health and substance misuse services working together, or do you have examples of the revolving door? So there's that. And equally, how assured are you that if adult safeguarding receives a referral and triages it out, in other words, it's referred to a locality team or a mental health team, how assured is adult safeguarding that the person is safeguarded with whatever route you have sent the referral down? A concern I have as a SAB chair and as a SAR author is that sometimes Section 42 concerns are sent to a locality team or a mental health trust, and the adult safeguarding aspect of that referral is then lost. and the local authority does not know whether the individual has been safeguarded from the abuse or neglect that was part of the referral. So I think certainly in my experience, there is more to do to ensure that the decision making on Section 42 concerns is secure, and that where a concern is redirected, the local authority remains responsible for ensuring that the individual has been safeguarded. Helen, you put your hand up. That might be in response to what I've just said, or it might be something else, but then we will stop for coffee.
I promise, yeah, I was just aware. I mean, I think it's interesting because I work with Sukhvinder, Scott and Fleur and other people on this call. I class myself as a commissioner of services. That is my level of expertise. I'm not in housing, I'm not in health, but it's our team that are kind of facilitating and supporting the Making Every Adult Matter approach and all of the wonderful challenges and opportunities that brings. But just kind of coming back really to the point that Katie raised, and I'm sure you'll have seen this many, many times in your work, but that issue where people are damaging property, they're constantly being evicted, we see this cycle. We talked a little bit about what we mean by engagement. I completely 100% agree. And again, I've met with many colleagues across the county that also agree with that. But there is something there around, we find ourselves in case discussions about support that we can commission for people. But it's that continuous cycle of they just keep getting evicted. We can't do anything, or we're going to, you know, and there has to be something more we can do about that. I appreciate there's lots more we need to do in advance, but where do we go with those conversations, I guess, is my question.
I think where you go depends in part on how much you know about the individual. One of the things that strikes me, particularly as a SAR author, is how little services know about the individuals with whom they're working, how little they know about the life journey, the backstory. Billy, for example, whom I've just mentioned, I learned more from talking to Billy's sister and Billy's cousin, both of whom knew him very well. I learned more from them about Billy than I learned from any chronology provided by any service. One or two of the chronologies from services referenced that he had talked about adverse experiences in childhood. One service actually knew what one of those experiences was. No one really knew the complete picture, but Billy's sister and his cousin gave me that picture. Now, why is that? Was it that no one asked? Or no one persisted when Billy didn't want to talk about it? Did anyone actually consistently say to Billy, what has happened to you? Can you help me to understand how you are responding today? Do we actually acknowledge that actually how people are responding might be, from their point of view, a perfectly rational response to what has happened to them? I can think of another review I've just done for Cornwall, which is not yet published, but will be. It involves a mother and a son. The son held a very responsible job in the civil service in London. He was alcohol dependent. On one occasion, he said to the substance misuse services, I drink in order to feel numb. I actually asked the practitioner, what did he mean by that? What was he trying to be numb from? And the practitioner said, I didn't ask. I actually know, or at least I have a hypothesis about what he was drinking to be numb from, because I talked to a family member who had known him from when he was a child. And I got a sense of what it might have been like for him to grow up with a mother who didn't want him and a father who didn't like him. You know, and how he might have responded psychologically and emotionally to that, and that alcohol might have been a part of that. So how much do we know? How much do we really understand? That would be part of my response to the challenge that you pose, Helen. I think part of my other response was that we actually have to share the risk. We actually have to convene the system. We have to bring everybody together, everybody who knows the individual and everybody who might be able to pull a lever to release a resource that the practitioners and operational managers might not have access to. So I'm talking here about senior leaders for very complex and challenging cases. And I think at times we have to be prepared to put cases in front of the Court of Protection and to actually say to a judge, we're not entirely sure what to do here. We're not entirely sure whether we have the lawful authority to do what we might want to do here. And we're asking for your support.
Okay.
I think we're frightened at times about putting things in front of a judge. I would far rather be told off by a judge rather than told off by a coroner along the lines of why the hell didn't you do something?
Very powerful. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Liz, if it's okay with you as board chair, I'm suggesting that we might have a 10-minute break and then I'll go back to my slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Thank you. So can we all come back just past 11:30, please? So a quick 10 minutes, 11:32, and we'll start straight on time. Lovely. Thanks, everybody. See you in 10 minutes time.